Okay. Um, I've been working with a lot of different organizations, typically industry originally. Um, but then when in the past years, when moving more and more into public sector, it became quite apparent quite quickly that they operate under some special circumstances. A lot of the practices that can apply are the same, but a lot of things are different as well. Um, Either whatever context, things like risk aversiveness, preference to status quo, dependence on outsourced resources, lacking of technical capabilities in-house, especially on a local government level, um, short-term, very siloed political incentives by the politicians. All of these are very special characteristics that impact the way in how public sector does open source when we talk about public sector open source projects. So now when we're talking about the public sector taking a higher level of responsibility, but also starting to develop and collaborate on open source, we need to understand how does these different frameworks or contextual factors really impact in how public sector can and should collaborate in the best of ways. Can they just go to the to-do group, or go to GitHub, or talk to whatever foundation and take the best practices out of the box, or do they need to like take a step back and start thinking about, okay, how should we best do this? This is especially important for public sector OSPOs, which are popping up all over. So we basically asked, how is development and collaboration happening in public sector open source projects? So this is a study we did, me, my colleague Sachiko, also of OpenForum Europe, and some researchers both from Spain and Sweden. We looked at, so we scraped a lot of data, and we looked at 6 different quite mature projects across. One being Energy Plus, basically a simulation tool for energy effectiveness in housing and building construction. It's developed by under the US Department of Energy by a number of different national research labs, each collaborating, each having their own like expertise in this. We looked at OS2 Forms, an e-service platform developed in collaboration between 10 to 15 municipalities in Denmark under the umbrella of OS2, so a Danish association, or what you could call a municipal open source foundation that has about 80 out of the 98 municipalities in Denmark, and they have about 28 projects today that have been initiated by these municipalities, and they work very closely with vendors to get the development going. And then we have Oskari. It's basically the foundation for the Finnish national geoportal, and it's developed by the National Land Survey of Finland. So they are doing the main development, but they have a smaller community, about 10, 15 other ministries, agencies, and organizations on a global level, actually, that contribute to the development in different ways. And then we have GeoTrek, a hiking platform, you could simplify it, for French national parks. That is, they have about 150 national parks behind this collaboration, where one of the national parks is heading the collaboration, leading it in collaboration with a specific vendor. And then we have the Marche Simplifié, also a kind of e-service platform from France, developed by Dinum, used by a lot of the public sector entities in France. And then we have the IO app, basically a single entry application in Italy for various public services, typically in related to finance. And it's developed by Pagopa, a state-owned service supplier, which was created really to grow the capabilities to become vendor independent. So basically growing the capabilities that is typically outsourced to vendors. So these are all various projects showing different characteristics of how development in public sector is done. So coming into this, we had this. We also talked about the cathedral and bazaar that Kaylin mentioned yesterday. We didn't think really that there was this community collaboration and that we were expecting development to be more concentrated, which we actually saw in the data as well. So we did both quantitative analysis and interviews across these projects, and we saw that development is often centered to a core team of developers, up to 15 or less. That's actually producing the 80% most of the code coming out. This is often happening through open development process, more or less, through GitHub, recognizing that we use GitHub to scrape our data samples. They are generally formal structure processes, maybe compared to the more informal that you can expect in more grassroots or community-driven open source projects, although there's no one process. But generally very formally structured and agile, with high thresholds in terms of quality assurance, because these are critical projects that are used in the delivery of key digital public digital services in the different countries. And yeah, that aligns with the fact that they are generally, the development is generally centered to one organization, and that could be either one of the more resourceful organizations, public organizations, or a specific vendor. I think the formatting was kind of screwed, but yeah. I think it says in the bottom that software quality was generally considered as quite high, although this was more said from the public sector organizations, not the end users. So, with that in mind, looking into these different projects, we can notice two general types of governance structures or sponsorships, which are quite central here to really understand the sustainability aspects, which I'll come to in the end. One is the more centralized sponsorship, where development is carried out by one or a single or a very few number of public sector organizations. These are very resource strong. So here we can talk about on the one side where you have maybe the more single organization comparable to the single vendor open source projects like the IO app coming out of Pagoppa in Italy. It's basically only developed only by that company. It's open source mainly for transparency reasons. They get very few contributions back. They don't really expect collaboration happening. Then there are those where there are a bit more, a few more organizations, but still very centered, like for the Energy Plus project, where there are a number of these national research institutes collaborating, but it's still a very tight collaborations with a very few number of PSOs or public sector organizations collaborating. So, I mean, this is a spectrum, but it's very concentrated to a few and resourceful organizations that has the resources typically in-house. Yeah, and then there's the other process, which is a bit more community-based, the decentralized sponsorship, where you have these less resourceful organizations that need to come together and pool their resources in order to be able to do something, in order to have a collaboration going. They typically, in the case of OS2, they come together under a formal foundation-ish stewardship structure, a municipal association. In the case of Geotrek, they come together in a more informal community where one of the national parks is actually heading the collaboration. So that doesn't have the formal open source foundation structure that you maybe would expect. Still, they are talking about it, but they're doing it in a bit more agile way in that sense. And then development resources, as I said, it's typically done within one organization. Either from the vendor side in the small projects, or through consultants used by the more larger, more resourceful organizations. There was typically, I don't know if I have that. Yeah, So in the case of Oskari, the Finnish national geoportal project, the Finnish National Land Survey, they had this strategy in mind that they took on consultants on a rotating basis to really help disseminate and bring in new people that could learn the product, get to know it, and then when they come out, start offering it as a service through their various SMEs or suppliers. So this is using these consultants on rotation. That was a strategic way for them to grow a vendor ecosystem around the project. Planning and decision making, generally top down from the public sector or within the public sector entities, either through technical steering committees with the representation of the various sponsors in OS2 forms. The municipalities, they have representatives in a technical steering committee that meets every month to like prioritize and triage the backlog and so on and so forth. While in other cases, there could be more direct collaboration between the vendor and the products. So one risk here is that if the vendors are not really included in the governance, then there might risk becoming a larger gap between the users and those actually doing the development. So there needs to be a balance here. The public entities still need a safe room to be able to talk about procurement and these more regulatory aspects, but the vendors still need to be included in the governance and in the steering in some way to ensure a sustainable development and maintenance of the projects. And quite interesting is also to note that there was a very strong preference for national and local service suppliers across the cases. They want someone who speaks the same language and so on, and preferable like the more smaller sized, where there are easier to get a relationship going rather than the large consultancy firms that could otherwise be thought of, be typical. Communication, yeah, everyone used some form of public communication, but there also was a lot of close communication happening as well inside inside the various organizations, but also in direct communication with the vendors. So, for example, between saying these decentralized projects where there are multiple smaller organizations involved, they start, if there's no coordination or synchronization between the municipalities or whoever, and they start connecting directly with the vendor, then with time it will turn to a reality where the vendor actually has the implicit governance and coordination of the project. I'm currently supporting a Swedish open source project or public sector open source project where we have 200 out of 290 municipalities that are basically locked in for a soft locking to a small vendor due to miscommunication and miscoordination between the municipalities. There was like, okay, who's maintaining this? You're maintaining it. No, you're maintaining it. Everyone was talking directly to the vendor instead of talking to each other, and they were asking different things for the procurements. There was no coordination, and with time this has resulted in like, okay, now everyone is locked in, even though it was created for the full purpose or sole purpose to avoid vendor lock-in. So if we don't know how to do open source collaboration and development in the procurement process, if we don't know how to collaborate and communicate, I mean, if the intention is to avoid lock-in, I mean, yeah, you will end up there sooner or later. Community engagement. So these are the communities in public sector open source projects are typically more user-oriented, at least in the cases where you don't have these strong public sector national administration ministries doing their development. Everyone meets up and more contributes in terms of funding, subject matter expertise inputs into the requirements engineering process and quality assurance. Yeah, as I said, it's mostly user-driven rather than the more developer-driven model, which you find in more industry and community-founded or open source projects. And the community size is rather limited. We had a case of Geotrek, which has about 150 organizations engaged in the collaboration. But if you count the number of end users of these products, which underpin these public digital public services, I mean, we're talking about millions in a sense. So it's about who are you talking to in terms of users here. It's important to have in mind. And then coming to the sustainability, in terms of decentralized sponsorship, I mean, this is very aligning with with the challenges we find in general context, where if you're adopting an open source project developed by one organization, or if one organization is really driving most of the, we have an elephant factor of one, or there's one organization doing like 50% or more of the development, there is a big risk. There is a big risk that that organization will pivot, refactor, move to something else, have changed priorities, and this is very much the same fact in public sector. And the political uncertainties and how agendas, I mean, national administrations, they act on the instructions they're given by the government, and those can change quite quickly. And on the municipal level, priorities are changed quite often, especially where due to short-sighted horizons by local government policymakers, and the impact of these advocates in the IT departments that really drive the adoption of open source, which can easily jump ship. And if we look at decentralized sponsorship, we have this dependence on collective funding. If we look in those two forms of project, we have 10 to 15 municipalities, but that's bare minimum. It's really dependent on some core municipalities really taking a larger share almost, and sometimes they need to, the more stronger ones need to go outside of the collaboration and fund things directly to the vendor. There's in another project with in the Netherlands with the Signali project, basically a public system for reporting issues in the public space. That comes out of the city of Amsterdam, but now it's like they are doing most of the development, and now for each municipality that starts adopting it, they start adding new requirements that the city of Amsterdam doesn't really care for or need. And then it's, how do we do this long term? How can we sustain this project? So now, for some time, they've been trying to push this into a stewardship of the Dutch Association of Municipalities and Regions, it's quite difficult because they need to come up to a certain level, like between 30 and 40 municipalities, for it to become sustainable. Because until then, will be very much dependent on the city of Amsterdam still for it to continue to stay developed. And the final point in terms of dependence on supplier interest, so a big barrier for public administration, especially again on the local level, is that but we need professional support. We can't just adopt it. It's good that there's open source alternatives, but we need the professional support. Where's the vendors? We need the vendors here in order to enable any kind of adoption. So growing a healthy vendor ecosystem around whatever project is key if we want adoption of these public sector open source projects or projects in general. And that again comes down to, you need to consider in terms of how vendors are included in the governance, in the coordination, ensuring that the vendors have a sustainable business model. Say if you only have 10 to 50 municipalities, the market is quite small, then you can't expect to have 3 different vendors. Then maybe you you need to be satisfied with one vendor, but then to compensate, you need to ensure that you you have the documentation in place. Everything is in order for should something shit hit the fan, you can still switch to another vendor, onboard a new vendor, even though there will be a cost attached to that, and consider licensing options and whatever the different aspects, so to ensure that there can be a sustainable model, business model for the vendors. So that's super important. And yeah, some final recommendations. I mean, super important to share and disseminate knowledge, communicate with each other, talk to each other, have a joint governance. As I said, it happens quite easy because municipalities, they work siloed by nature quite often. If you don't talk to each other, you will end up in a soft lock-in sooner or later, or in some kind of unsustainable situation. And try to long-term think about the stewardship and hosting and maintenance situation of the product. Quite often it's not within the scope, assignment, and financial state for a single entity, public sector entity, to host and drive and maintain a product long-term. Sooner or later there will most probably be need for some kind of neutral stewardship, just as we have open source foundations. Yeah, and grow the capabilities needed to support open source adoption, knowledge sharing, and how to leverage procurement and so on. Again, it's not we can borrow and take a lot of best practice from industry, but a lot of the practice we need to grow in the public sphere as well. Yeah, and again, grow a competitive ecosystem of service suppliers. Yeah, and that's about it.